I've driven a lot of sports cars, but to get a legendary one for under $11,000, you're only talking Mazda RX-7. Cockpit's very well thought out. Everything's right where it should be. And nothing delivers power as smoothly as Mazda's rotary engine, all the way up through all 5 gears. Near perfect balance, too. At 10,945 sports car value just doesn't get any better. Mazda RX-7.
Hello everyone! In today's video, I'll be showcasing the entire build process of this 1/24 scale 1979 Mazda RX-7. This car uses Revell's highly detailed, recently re-released 2-in-1 RX-7 model kit and a bare-bones, easy-to-print universal Make It RC chassis. The goal for this build was to be a simple, easy-to-work-on, fun-to-drive car with great scale looks. I also included a gyro and hard plastic tires with the hope that it will do some drifting. I'll be showing the entire build from unboxing to driving and every step in between. If you'd like to do a similar build yourself, be sure to check out the links below in the description and our most recent blog post for more information. With that said, let's get started. The build started with this Revell Mazda RX-7 2-in-1 kit. It features parts for both a stock or a race version. It's a relatively simplified kit, which doesn't contain a huge amount of individual parts, but everything does look really well molded. This is a kit that I've had for a little while. I think it was re-released by Revell maybe a couple years ago, give or take, but I was really eager to get this car built. These kits can still be easily found for sale online. As you can see here as I get all the parts laid out, everything looks really well molded and this kit has some very nice detail. I also really like all the decals that are included along with the additional parts for the race car version. Of course, being an RC build, not all of these parts will be used, but the additional parts are always great to have around, and I'm sure some parts like the tires and engine will make their way into a diorama at some point. I will be including the interior and a somewhat detailed engine bay, so I will be utilizing some of those parts for this build. The body looks fantastic. As I said, I was eager to get this car built. I had some ideas in my head of how I wanted the finished car to look, and I was very excited to get started. One thing that was immediately apparent was how small this car is compared to the larger Camaro and Chevelle I had built previously. Even the Foxbody SVO is quite a bit larger, so I knew getting everything to fit might be a bit of a challenge, but nothing a little engineering and creativity can't work out. So I moved on to building the chassis. The FPU-C1 chassis I'm using for this car is an old design, but this is the first time I've built a car shown on this channel that uses it. It's about as brutally simple of a chassis that's possible, while still offering some adjustability. There is no suspension nor a realistic drivetrain layout, but all the plastic parts can be easily 3D printed, as you can see here. The STL files can be found on Patreon or already printed parts on our store, along with a hardware kit that contains all the non-printable parts. If you'd like to build one of these chassis, you'll find the links to those pages and more information below in the description. There are currently two sizes of chassis pieces, one for shorter wheelbase bodies and one for longer wheelbase bodies. The shorter wheelbase one is what I'm using, as the RX-7 body only has a wheelbase of around 100 millimeters. There are different size parts for the front to accommodate bodies with different widths. My recommendation is to print out all of them, or at least several different sizes, and do some mock-ups to figure out which size works the best for your body. While I had some other size front end parts printing, I began removing all the parts that I'll be using from the parts tree and test fit them. It was clear that the interior tub was going to need some modifications for it to fit. My plan was to cut out the bottom of the interior and make a new floor much higher up to create a shallow tub interior. This would leave room below for electronics. The motor mount and rear axle is all one assembly. The gears are large and only have 6 teeth to make them easy to print. Again, as I said, all the hardware and other non-printable parts you see can be ordered from our site as a kit. The assembly is pretty simple. The 2 bearings for the rear axle are press fit into place. After that, I secure the N20 motor and gear assembly to the mount. The motor gear can be press fit onto the motor shaft. The threaded axle shaft goes through the bearings, and I use 2 hex wheel mounts on each side to secure the axle, making any adjustments so there is the same length sticking out on each side. Once that looks good, I glue the wheel mount on the opposite side of the gears to the shaft. I do not glue the other wheel mount. I wait for the glue to dry and then remove it and replace it with the other gear, which I glue to the shaft. Everything should turn smoothly as it does here. The wheelbase is adjustable depending on where you mount this assembly. For this RX-7, I'm going to be mounting it all the way towards the front, which gives the chassis a 100mm wheelbase. At this point, all of the front end parts that I would be using had been printed, so I began installing them. I decided that I would build a wide-body version of the car with the included fender flare pieces. Just like with the rear, assembling the front end parts is pretty simple. Here I'm assembling and installing the steering knuckles. For the front axles, I'm using a standard M2 bolt that I push from the back through the bearings and then glue the front wheel mounts in place to prevent the axles from sliding out. Here's a closer look at the chassis so far. At this point, I put on some mock-up wheels and double-checked that the wheelbase was correct and that everything will fit. So far, everything was looking good, though it was clear that some material was going to need to be removed from under the hood to allow the body to sit low enough. I thought it would be nice to have at least somewhat of a detailed engine bay when the hood is opened, so I tried to not remove more than what I had to for the body to fit. After some time spent cutting and sanding, the body was now fitting much better over the chassis. With the under the hood sections looking good, I turned my attention to the interior. At first I just removed a section large enough to allow more clearance for the rear gears to let the body and interior tub sit level. I will soon be doing much more work to it, but first I installed the steering servo. To allow the interior to fit while leaving room for the electronics beneath it, I removed the entire lower section of the interior tub. After cleaning up the edge, I traced the shape onto a piece of styrene, then cut that shape out and glued it to the bottom of what's left of the interior. There were a few small gaps around the edge, which I filled in with putty. There's much more room below the interior now, but I noticed that the gears were once again hitting the bottom of the interior, so I made a raised section in the rear. I also removed a section here around the servo arm. With that complete, I needed a way to secure the interior to the chassis, but still allow it to be removable. To do this, I cut some pieces of styrene tube that will be glued to the chassis. On top of each will be magnets, allowing the interior and body to be removable. This process, as you can see, is very straightforward. The most important thing though is to make sure that all of them are the same height. Once they were the correct height, one magnet could be glued to each mount, and one matching magnet onto the bottom of the interior tub. I made sure that the body was correctly aligned and level. It turned out that I needed to add a little material to the front of the interior tub to make sure that the body was level. The magnets work great and are super convenient compared to using screws. To finish up the chassis, I installed the steering linkage. Make sure that the steering center link is the correct length for the front end parts that you choose. Otherwise, you're going to have some crazy toe angle. I had installed the steering servo the wrong way before, so I corrected it and finished installing the linkage. I did need to remove a little more material from the interior to make sure there was enough room for the arm. To keep the nuts on the steering linkage from coming loose, I used some thread lock. After making sure that there is enough clearance for all the steering parts, I moved on to test fitting the fender flares. Each one fit very snug against the body. I remeasured the width, so I know how wide and how far out I wanted the wheels to be. The next step was to move on to wiring and mounting all of the electronics. Here's a look at the electronics that I chose for this car. The receiver is a Radiolink R6FG, which I'll be pairing to a RC4G transmitter. The battery is a 180 mAh 2S LiPo, and the ESC is a standard 10 amp micro ESC that you can find on our store. The first thing that I did was remove the case from the receiver. This makes the receiver take up less space. One issue that remains though is that with the plug-in, it's still too tall for the interior. I'll be addressing this issue soon, but first I needed to solder the new battery plug onto the ESC to match the one on the battery. I also soldered a JST connector onto the motor. I connected all of the components and powered everything up to bind the receiver and make sure everything is working. With everything operating as it should, I next needed to figure out where each component was going to be mounted. The center of the chassis was the best spot for the receiver, but like I said before, when the ESC and servo are plugged in, they are too tall for the interior to fit. To fix this, I removed each little connector and individually connected each one to the pins on the receiver. In the past, I had simply soldered each wire directly to the receiver. However, doing it this way is less permanent and it's easier to change out components. Just make sure the wires don't touch and are correctly hooked up. The ESC is just narrow enough to fit up front. I do like to frequently check everything along the way to ensure that everything continues to function as it should. To save space, I removed the on-off switch and wired the two ends together so the car will turn on when the battery is connected. Another space-saving modification was removing the JST connector from the ESC and motor and just soldering the wires together. Once everything was looking good, the final step was to mount everything to the chassis using double-sided tape. The result ended up being very compact. I used some zip ties to tidy up the wires and some Velcro to hold the battery in place. This receiver includes a built-in gyro, which will hopefully help it to do some drifting. One thing that I noticed was the battery wires were touching the rear axle when the interior was in place. To fix this, I cut and glued a small piece of styrene to prevent the connector and wires from rubbing against the axle. I noticed that the body seemed to be sitting a little too low. Fortunately, because of the body mount design, all I needed to do was add some additional magnets to act as spacers. With the electronics complete, I could move on to completing the car and getting it ready for paint. I wanted to design some custom wheels for this car. I didn't model them after anything in particular, but just came up with a sort of generic 4-spoke design. I used Autodesk Fusion 360 to model the wheels. I will be making these wheels available for sale on our store page, or for download to any Maker Tier patrons. I was really pleased with the final design. I made a wider set for the rear, which should look great. I printed each wheel using an SLA printer. The tires were printed using PLA plastic on a typical FDM printer. I did some quick mock-ups with the new wheels and determined how far out I wanted the rear wheels to be, and then glued the wheel mounts into position on the axle shaft. I needed to remove just a tiny bit of material from the outside of the interior to allow enough clearance. I threaded a 4x2mm wheel mount onto each front axle shaft to push the front wheels out a little more. So far, so good. I was already really liking how this car was turning out. Next, I did some work on the body to remove any imperfections and sand away any mold lines. I also deepened all the panel gaps. I like to use a marker to identify any mold lines or other imperfections I want to address. I did make a few very minor modifications to the body. These include filling in the front marker lights with putty and sanding away the front and rear emblems. This just gives the car a slightly cleaner look. I also glued the lower front piece to the rest of the body. To keep the hood secure, but still allow it to be opened, I used some magnets, just like I've done many times previously. I decided that this section on the strut tower would be a good place to drill out a hole for the magnets to fit into. Once the lower magnets were secured in place, I set another magnet on top of each and then glued them to the underside of the hood. A really clean and simple way of adding magnets to the hood on this body. By this time, the putty had dried and I could sand this area flush with the rest of the body. I went around the outer surface with 600 grit sandpaper for better primer adhesion. Here I did a little trimming and sanding around the outer edges of the windows to get them to fit tight up against the body. The spoiler, flares, and front bumper needed just a little work to clean them up and get them to fit snug. It's worth a few minutes of extra sanding to really get the fit and finish of the car as good as I can make it. As I said, the kit is really well molded and everything fits well right out of the box, so not much work is needed. Since the fender flares will be added, I wanted to widen all the wheel arches. This is partially cosmetic, but also necessary in the front, since the front wheels extend out pretty far from the knuckle and need room to turn left and right. I gradually removed more and more material, making sure I didn't remove too much. In addition to modifying the body, I also moved in the front wheels slightly closer by swapping the 4x2mm wheel mounts with a 4x1mm mount. I ended up removing about as much material as I could from the front, which fortunately allowed the front wheels to turn without issues. I already had the magnetic mounts for the interior tub in place, but I still needed a way to secure the body to the interior tub. Although gluing would be the easiest option, I don't like that it will make the interior and body permanently attached. Instead, I used Velcro, just like I've done on previous projects. Since the inside of the doors curve out, I needed to glue some pieces of styrene to the inside of the body, so the Velcro pieces are close enough together. This keeps the interior and body tightly secured, but still allows the two parts to be separated if needed. With the body sitting so low, however, some more material needed to be removed. I really wanted the car to have a relatively low ride height. At this point, I couldn't resist doing a quick test drive. The right front wheel had some resistance, which I corrected later by adjusting the wheel mount. Although it's no serious drifter, it is a lot of fun to slide around. Here I was messing around with gyro settings and weight distribution. With the car fully functioning, I cleaned up the edges and did any final sanding. I removed a few interior and under the hood parts that I planned on using. I glued the brake master cylinder assembly to the firewall. At this point, I was planning on using the radiator, however later I decided not to install it due to limited space, and I don't really have a good way of mounting it to the body. I liked the seats that came with this kit and didn't want to cut them up, so I got a set of GRS 300 seats to use instead. As a bonus, I do think a set of racing style seats ended up looking very cool and added to the modified look I wanted for this car. I needed to make a few minor modifications to the dash to get it to fit. Once the dash was in place, I added the steering wheel. The seats required some serious hacking, but looked great once installed. I'm including the roll bar that came in the kit. I just needed to remove some material from the bottom and then glue it behind the seats. Although it's certainly lacking some depth, it'll still look really cool in the car. The windows will also be tinted, so the interior won't be super visible anyway. The last thing to do was install the front bumper. I masked off the Velcro and moved on to painting. At this point, all the parts were ready for paint. I made sure to mask any sections that I didn't want painted, and then taped them to some popsicle sticks to make them easy to hold. I started by applying primer to the interior, and then I painted all of the radiator parts satin black. With the interior fully assembled like this, it's difficult to get the paint into some of the hard to reach areas. However, with the interior not going to be too easily visible, it won't be a problem. I painted the wheels gloss black and applied white primer to the body. All of the optional body parts that I'll be using were painted flat black. I used Krylon Gloss Jungle Green for the body. Between some of the coats of paint that I applied to the body, I used some 1000 grit sandpaper to remove any dust or other imperfections from the paint. After a few coats, everything was looking great. The primer applied to the interior gave it some cool texture. The paint on the body turned out looking great, but I wanted to make it look even better. I started by wet sanding the entire body, starting with 1000 grit sandpaper, and kept going to finer and finer grits. Once the paint began looking shiny again, I polished it. I then applied a few coats of clear. Aside from a few little imperfections here and there, the clear looked great, and I repeated the same sanding and polishing steps as before. At this point, the paint looked great, and I was ready to begin reassembling everything. To secure the fender flares, I used micro crystal clear glue. As the name implies, the glue dries clear. It's also easy to wipe away excess with a wet paper towel. I really like the look of the matte black fenders paired with the green body. Next, I installed the front and rear spoiler. After that, I began working on all the clear plastic parts. After doing any final sanding and once again confirming that everything fits, I made some custom side windows, first by tracing the opening and then using it as a stencil to cut pieces of clear plastic. I also did a little sanding on the taillights to ensure that they will fit. With all the windows and taillights fitting great, it was time to apply some tint. Using Tamiya Smoke, I lightly tinted the windshield and taillights and gave the side windows and rear glass a heavier tint. While waiting for that to dry, I turned my attention to under the hood. I wanted to add an engine of some kind to this area, though it would need to be very thin. If I was to use the engine included in the kit, there wouldn't be much room left by the time I chopped it up to fit. I have this LS V8 engine cover that will work great, though I will need to make a mount for it. The tint was complete, though I thought the result was a little mediocre, with the tint looking very uneven and making anything behind the windows look blurry. To help fix this, I came back later and applied some more coats to the side and rear windows, which although made them less transparent, the tint was at least a lot more even. Before doing that though, I added some detail to the rear glass with a brush. I also went around the entire perimeter with a permanent marker. Although it is a heavy tint, they are far more transparent in person than how it looks on camera. I glued the windshield in place, though after doing so, I realized I should have painted the weather stripping first. Fortunately, this wasn't a big deal. I just made sure to mask on either side and paint the perimeter black. This paint was left over from another project, and I thought it was acrylic paint, which would make it easy to scrape away any excess, as I've done previously. However, it ended up not wanting to be removed, so the edges are a little rough, but nothing too bad overall. While waiting for it to dry, I painted some other details around the bumpers. I wanted to leave the majority of the bumper's body color, except for a little part on the sides. I then moved on to painting the remaining weather stripping and other details around the body. The body looks much better after these small details have been painted. I also wanted to add some more details under the hood. I used semi-gloss black, flat black, steel, and white paint to do so. I also painted the engine. Here are the chrome parts that I planned on using. All of them needed some black paint. I ended up not using the side view mirror since I didn't really like how it looked. I once again used more of the crystal clear glue to secure the rear view mirror to the windshield. After that, each window was glued into place. I'm using the same process to paint the taillights as I have in the past. I start by painting the white, then the clear orange, and then clear red, masking off other sections as necessary. So far, so good. Next, I backed everything with silver and went around the outside with a black Sharpie marker. The finished result looks great, especially with the light tint that I applied earlier. The car is now nearing completion and already looking awesome. The interior is hard to see on camera, but in person it's noticeable enough to know it's there, but not so visible that it's obvious it's only a shallow interior. Here I'm gluing the fan shroud to the radiator, though as I said before, I decided not to include it at this time, though I did install the piece that goes above the radiator, which is easy to glue to the body. I really like the inclusion of an engine bay on this car. Even though it's not the most detailed, it's still really cool to have. I still need to make a mount for the engine cover, but first I added the license plate to the rear. The taillights were installed next using the clear glue. I cut a few pieces of styrene to make a little mount for the engine to sit on. Before gluing the engine to the mount, I painted it black. There is just barely enough clearance for the steering linkage, but it all fits. Waiting for the black paint to dry, I realized that I hadn't yet painted the front turn signals, so I did so by first painting silver and then clear orange. There were three final things I wanted to add to the car, the first being add some brake discs to all the wheels, which I sanded and then painted with Model Master's steel paint. I 3D printed a tailpipe piece to go on the rear. I needed to make a mount for it, which I did using styrene. Before gluing it to the car, I painted it. By this time the paint had dried on the rotors, so they could be glued to the wheels. The final thing to do was cut the front axle shafts a little shorter so they don't stick out as far. At this point I was satisfied with how the car looked and was ready to consider it complete. The final result turned out great. I really like the way the fender flares and spoilers look on the car, along with the green and flat black paint. The car has a modified look, though nearly everything you see was included with the model kit. That's one of the reasons I always enjoy building these 2-in-1 kits and having all the extra parts. Of course, now I wanted to see how the car would drive, so I set up a small track. Although the chassis is extremely simple, the car is still just as fun to drive. The front spoiler was low enough that it was catching on some of the bumps between each piece of foam mat, so I added a few magnets to lift the body up for more clearance. There isn't much to say as far as the driving. It's very smooth both with the steering and throttle. It's not able to get around a course as fast as something with a differential and suspension could, but that isn't the point of this build. The plastic tires grip the foam pretty well, but still let the car slide around some from time to time. On hardwood floors, the car is a lot of fun to slide around. It sort of almost drifts, but is hard to handle. I think with some more practice and tuning, I could get it to drift at least somewhat well, but regardless, it's still a lot of fun. I'm also going to be experimenting with driving it on smooth concrete to see how it handles on that surface. It's an all-around really fun little car that I enjoyed building, and I hope you enjoyed watching as well. Be sure to check out the links in the description below for more information and to see the products used. I documented this entire build on the Scale Builders Guild forums, and plan on doing this for more upcoming projects as well. So if you're interested in seeing more builds like this documented on the SBG forums, be sure to be on the lookout for more posts there as well. I've really been enjoying browsing through the forums, and I've learned some new things as well. So I would highly recommend these forums to anyone interested in scale-accurate RC builds, especially off-road vehicles. To finish up this video, I want to showcase some of the awesome vehicles and projects showcased on the Make It RC Facebook group. Thank you all very much for watching, and I'll see you next time.